see you all. I want to take a moment just to say something about this institute that I'm a part of, which is called the Institute of Human Development and Social Change, as David mentioned. So even though I'm at the Steinhardt School, I'm in the Department of Applied Psychology there, at the Institute I have an opportunity to work with students and faculty across all of NYU. And what we really try to do is try to put our heads together to try to solve some social problems, locally, globally, using rigorous research and using evidence-based policy and practice. So hopefully if you end up here at some point, I will have an opportunity to interact with you, even if you're not part of the Steinhardt School. But I have spent a lot of my career, really the past 15 years or so, studying peers in school. And sometimes people ask me why I study this. And often I respond with my own question, and I'm going to ask you to come with me on this journey for a moment and think back to when you were in 7th grade. So for some of you, that was just a couple of years ago, a few years ago, and for others, perhaps a little bit longer ago. So think about a memorable moment that you had in 7th grade. And it could have been something that was embarrassing or sad or joyous or surprising. So get a moment in your mind. And now raise your hand if in that moment you remember that there was at least one other young person your age involved. So most of you, and for me as well. So peers are ubiquitous. They are all over the place in schools, much more so than adults. And they play a role that can't really be duplicated by parents or teachers or coaches or any other adult. And that's what we're going to talk about today, what that role looks like. So if you think about that role, sometimes it's an opportunity for companionship and intimacy, to be able to share secrets with somebody and have those not disclosed to other people. Sometimes you have an opportunity with peers to figure out how to compromise when you don't see things the same way, figure out how to empathize when someone's going through a hard time. And sometimes with peers, it's harder than that, right? There are challenges that you might face with your peers, and there are temptations that you might face. So we're going to try to go through some of these kinds of experiences, but what I want you to kind of take away from this, at least at the moment, is that peers are a significant and salient part of kids' lives. And they're everywhere in the media, right? So Hollywood and the mass media, and sometimes, unfortunately, real life, tell us a particular message, which is that peers are negative. They're bad influences and they cause harm. But peers also have great potential to enhance kids' learning and kids' development. And this is particularly true during this transition that some of you remember well and some of you might choose not to remember, which is this transition to adolescence that happens between the ages of about 8, 9, 10, and then moving forward through that middle school period and high school. And there's a lot that happens in this transition. It's in a time of immense fluidity and immense change. So kids start to experience brain development that really is rivaled only by the brain development that happens in infancy and early childhood. And in adolescence, the prefrontal cortex, right in the front of your brain, is what is rapidly developing, maturing. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for executive functions, for things like planning and organization and regulation. The other thing that happens is that kids generally move to a new school during this period, and sometimes more than one new school. So raise your hand if you move to a new school in either 6th or 7th grade. And raise your hand if you move to a new school in 9th grade. So about 90% of US public school students make a transition in these early years. And this presents new social and academic challenges for those young people to try to navigate. And so beyond these brain changes and physical and biological changes and school changes, there are social changes as well. So kids begin to function more often in their peer groups without adult supervision. And as you see from those figures on the right, both boys and girls are spending more time with peers and alone as they're transitioning between 5th and 9th grade, and somewhat less time with their families. And in fact, a teen, if you ask them who is important in their life, will name many, many people. About half of the people they name will be kids their own age. So, peers are ubiquitous. Peer relationships are important as kids are transitioning into the period of adolescence. But what do we mean when we talk about peer relationships? How do we understand them? How do we know whether they exist and for whom and why they might matter? So we start by asking kids. So we ask them, who do you like most? Who do you like least? And what we find is that if we ask these questions of a whole bunch of kids in a particular setting, like a classroom or a grade or a school, then we get a sense of their social acceptance overall in the peer environment. And it turns out that social acceptance is particularly important for kids in elementary school in particular. We also ask them, who do you hang out with often? Who do you spend time with at lunch? Who do you spend time with before and after school or in the classroom? And what this does is this gives us a sense of the broader peer social network. So you see the difference between like most, like least, and hang out with. These are people that you spend time with. You may not be best friends with them, but you're hanging around them a lot. And it turns out that being part of the social network and not being peripheral to or isolated from that social network is increasingly important in those early adolescent years through middle school and then high school. And then we also ask, who is your friend and who is your best friend? And we find that friendship, when it is mutual, when it is bidirectional, when it is reciprocal between dyads, is critical at every single age. All right, so that sounds very simple, very easy, but there's incredible nuance and complexity to all of this. And I'm gonna just tell you about a couple of the areas in which there's nuance and complexity. So, definitions of friendship. If you were to turn to the person behind you or in front of you and ask them what their definition of friendship is, it's likely to be a little bit different than your definition. Even if you turn to the person next to you, who you might know quite well, it's likely to be a little bit different. And this is what we find with kids as well, that these differences vary by age, by culture, by gender. Some kids prioritize companionship. They want someone to do things with, particularly younger kids. Some kids prioritize this idea of self-disclosure, having someone to share, things that are important to you and have them not necessarily disclosed to others. And some kids prioritize having conflict and being able to then resolve that conflict and get through it, like maybe Calvin and Susie might. You might wonder about the accuracy of kids' self-reports. So if you ask someone who their friend is or who they hang out with, are they fabricating those relationships? Do they imagine that they want to have a friendship that they don't yet have? And that can happen. And so what we do is we actually ask as many kids as we possibly can in that setting about friendships, about hanging out relationships. And what that does is that gives us multiple perspectives of that classroom social environment, of that grade level in that school, of that team. And those multiple perspectives gives us a full understanding, a better, a richer understanding of the social dynamics in that space. And lastly, this question of liked most and liked least. People often say to me, well, somebody who is liked most by a lot of kids also might be liked least by a lot of kids. And I imagine you can think of people in your own school or your own workplace who could be, in fact, like that. And this does exist. These peers are called controversial. They are often perceived to be popular and influential in the social group. All right, so even with these complexities and nuances, and this is just a tiny handful of them, we know now from decades of research in this area, some of it my own, much of it others, colleagues of mine research, is that peers do seem to matter, and they matter in particular ways. So they matter for good. So friendship, for example, can protect against experiences of victimization and depression. And this is particularly true when the friend is someone who is of moderate or higher status and is not someone who is also themselves peer victimized or rejected. So intergroup friendship, things like cross-race friendship and other kinds of intergroup interactions can decrease bias and can decrease victimization as well as, in fact, increase academic performance. Most of the work originally was between Black and white students' friendships. More recently, it has expanded to friendships between other groups, friendships between people of different home languages and different school behaviors, for example. Being connected to academically oriented peers, particularly if you yourself are not quite as academically oriented, can increase your own engagement, academic behaviors, and in fact, learning. And lastly, attending schools that have structured and supportive opportunities for peer interactions, things like peer tutoring or other kinds of peer-assisted learning, cooperative learning, service activities, and others, can increase the likelihood for the development of positive social, emotional, and academic skills. But of course, as you know from the title of my talk, peers also matter for bad. So being disconnected from peers entirely, being isolated, not having a friend, not being embedded in the broader peer social network matters for things like loneliness and sadness. People who are lonely and sad might be more disconnected to begin with, but it gets worse over time. It also matters for the development of social and academic skills. Again, someone who might be disconnected may not have as many of these skills to begin with, but then they worsen over time. On the other hand, being connected to influential peers who are also engaged in more antisocial and risky kinds of behaviors has its own challenges. And it can relate to more bystander behavior. So this is when you're observing negative behaviors, observing bullying, and not intervening in that and not defending. It also matters for things like antisocial identity and for one's own development of risky behaviors. Those are risky behaviors around delinquency, around substance abuse, and around risky sexual behaviors. And finally, and importantly, experiences of being rejected or victimized by peers is associated with loneliness and sadness. These are internalizing symptoms for some people, and then also for increases in aggression, actually, for others. It's linked to physical health symptoms, somaticization, headaches, stomach aches, et cetera, visits to the nurse. And it's linked to poor social skills and academic performance over time. And when researchers have studied this longitudinally, where they follow kids who have been systematically rejected and in particular systematically victimized over time, we find that there's cascading effects through schooling and into adulthood. But peer relationships do not happen in a vacuum. And the title of this talk is Peers in School. And we find that schools matter too. So peer relationships that are negative, their poor outcomes depend on things like the responses of the adults in the school building. So whether a principal intervenes in a productive way versus a punitive way, whether a counselor knows when and how to mediate a conflict, whether a teacher is available to listen and then to act in appropriate ways. Poor outcomes depend also on whether the child has a friend, as we mentioned earlier, to buffer against those negative interactions that they're having, and on the safety and the supportiveness of the school environment as a whole. We pay a lot of attention to classrooms. This goes beyond classrooms, to hallways, to bathrooms, to school grounds. And importantly, norms, social norms of aggression and prosocial behavior in given classrooms, in given grade levels, in given schools, make a huge difference. So this is asking yourself, is this a space where it's okay to use aggression to solve conflict or not okay? Is this a space where it's cool to help one's peers or not so cool? And schools matter for the development of positive relationships and not only the prevention of negative outcomes via negative relationships. So positive relationships develop in schools when teachers are observant of the social dynamics in their classrooms, and then they act with skill afterwards. So in my own work, we find that some teachers only observe about 10% of the friendships in a classroom in which they're spending 9 months out of the year. And other teachers observe more like 70% of those friendships. They recognize them and they acknowledge them. So when teachers are observant in that way, and then they make subtle changes in how they group students and how they seat students and the kinds of scaffolding and support they give to students, their students across the course of that year develop more integration into the social network. So positive relationships also are developed in classrooms that are socially tied together, which means that lots of kids have lots of social relationships in that classroom, and those are equitably distributed and not just held by a small group of very popular kids. And in these classrooms, kids have fewer social problems and are more academically engaged. And finally, positive relationships develop when schools activate peers and not just adults in their building as potentially positive resources for one another. All right, so now that we know all of this, how accurate is what we see on television, in the movies, or in the news? Well, I don't think we would watch and we wouldn't care if there wasn't some accuracy to it. And clearly there is for some of these things. But what I want you to think about is how full are these depictions? How complete are these depictions? And they are not. They are a small sliver of peers' experiences in schools. So what we know is that peers are salient and they are influential for good and sometimes for bad. And they are also the most prevalent human resource, so we can't ignore them. But this doesn't mean that teachers and schools don't play a very active role in kids' peer experiences. In fact, some scholars indicate that teachers have what's called an invisible hand in peer relationships. And then schools, through their social climates, through their social norms, through their rules and routines and activities, can really exacerbate or reduce peer problems. And so this leads me to my final moment. And if there's nothing else that you remember from this talk, I'd love you to remember this, is that schools have a role to play. Not only in what they must do and they're mandated to do to address peer harassment and peer violence in schools, but also in what they could do, and potentially what they should do to create opportunities for more young people to access positive peer support systems in their schools. And we think that that will then maximize the likelihood that those young people develop the cognitive and the social emotional skills to succeed both in school and in life. And so if this happens, if schools meet this challenge and do not only what they must, but what they could and what they should, then when today's 7th graders are visiting college, when they are parents who are bringing their kids to visit college, and then they have to remember back to a moment in 7th grade themselves, they will remember their peers for good and not for bad. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise.